By late summer, the camp had transformed into something unreal, something that made Carl occasionally forget there was a war outside the barbed wire at all. The heat settled over the compound like a warm blanket. Dust kicked up with every footstep, coating boots and the hems of trousers. The scent of fresh-cut grass drifted across the recreation yard, carried by the rhythmic thud of baseballs hitting gloves and the shouts of prisoners playing soccer on the makeshift field. What shocked Carl most wasn't the freedom of movement or the quality of the food. It was how casual the Americans were with their prisoners. Guards lounged under shade canopies, drinking from canteens, chatting with one another while keeping a distant, watchful eye. They didn't stalk the perimeter like wolves. They didn't bark orders every 5 minutes. They treated the Germans as soldiers. Dangerous, yes, but still men. One afternoon, Carl found himself near the baseball field where a group of American MPs stood around a batting cage, cheering as one of their own hit practice pitches. "Tell your German buddies the softball game is at 6, one of them shouted toward a group of POWs nearby. Softball game? At 6? As though they were organizing a village festival. Otto's eyes lit up. "I want to play again," he said, already bouncing on his heels. Carl smirked. "You barely hit the ball last time." "That's because they threw it like it was artillery," Otto complained. "This time I'll be ready." "Your optimism is impressive," Carl said. "Optimism is all I have," Otto replied with a grin. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, Carl walked toward the fence where a group of Americans were fixing up the volleyball net. One of them, Corporal James "Jimmy" O'Donnell, spotted him and waved. "Hey, Hoffman," Jimmy called. "You play volleyball?" Carl blinked. The American remembered his name. "Not well," Carl answered cautiously. Jimmy grinned. "Good. That gives me a chance." Several prisoners nearby laughed softly. The casual banter was unnerving. It chipped away at the invisible wall the Reich insisted must always exist between Germans and their enemies. Carl stepped closer. "Why do you treat us like this?" he asked, unable to hold the question in any longer. Jimmy shrugged, tying a knot in the net. "Why wouldn't we? We are the enemy." "Sure," Jimmy replied, "but you're also prisoners. War's war. When you guys are captured, you're done. Our job is to keep you here, not beat you." Carl stared, unsure how to respond. Jimmy smirked. "Besides, you're pretty decent at soccer. Some of my boys still can't believe how fast you all are." That caught Carl off guard more than any flak burst he'd ever faced. Praise from the enemy? He stepped back, shaken. Later that evening, the prisoners started their soccer match on the far side of the yard, while the Americans played softball near the barracks. The sounds of cheering and laughter echoed across the compound. Carl found himself standing next to Meyer at the fence line, watching the American game. The pitcher lobbed a ball toward a scrawny private, who swung wildly and missed. The Americans booed and teased him with exaggerated disappointment. "They play like children," Meyer muttered. Carl disagreed, but said nothing. Suddenly, an MP near first base called out, "Hey, you Germans want to send a team next week? Winner plays the officers." Otto cheered. "Yes!" Meyer rolled his eyes. "Have some dignity, Weiss." But Otto wasn't listening. He raced off to spread the news to the rest of the POWs. Carl watched him go, feeling a strange ache in his chest. Otto was changing, becoming lighter, friendlier, less guarded. Was he changing too? The officers certainly thought so. That night, Vogel held a mandatory meeting in the barrack hall. He stood at the front, arms crossed, eyes burning like coal. "I see what the Americans are doing," Vogel said. "They give you comfort. They give you games. They smile. They relax the rules. They want you to forget who you are." Silence. "They want you to forget Germany," he continued. "Forget your duty. Forget discipline. And I see that some of you fools are falling for it." Otto stiffened. Meyer frowned. Carl said nothing. Vogel jabbed a finger toward the door. "Every soccer match you play weakens your resolve. Every American you exchange pleasantries with erodes your loyalty. You think they treat you well because they respect you? No. They treat you well because they want to break you from within." Carl felt the room tighten around him. "Mark my words," Vogel hissed. "The day will come when your softness will cost us everything." The officers dispersed after that, leaving the men in a heavy silence. But Carl couldn't shake a different thought, one Vogel surely didn't intend to plant. If kindness weakens us, what does that say about the strength of what we believed in? Over the next few weeks, the sports games continued. Carl found himself scanning the crowd during every match, watching for the Americans' reactions. Not intimidation, not strategy, not psychological warfare, just enjoyment. Humans being humans. One late afternoon, after a tense volleyball match, Jimmy approached Carl at the fence. "You're getting better," Jimmy said. "You might beat us next time." Carl managed a small smile. "We'll see." Jimmy leaned on the fence. "You know, sometimes I forget we're supposed to be enemies. I mean that." Those words rattled Carl more deeply than he expected. He walked back to the barracks alone, the sunset painting the sky orange and gold, the sound of distant laughter lingering in the air. Inside, his bunk felt smaller than usual. The barracks felt quieter. The war felt farther away. And the enemy felt alarmingly, disarmingly human. Carl lay awake long into the night, wrestling with a question he'd never dared ask before. If the Americans can treat us with fairness and dignity, then what does that say about Germany's war? Autumn arrived quietly. The mornings grew crisp, the afternoons mild, the evenings touched by a cool breeze that rustled through the camp's trees. The Americans issued extra blankets as temperatures dropped. They repaired stoves. They distributed wool caps and gloves for men on outdoor work details. Carl found himself assigned to the lumber crew, a group of 20 POWs tasked with cutting firewood at a nearby depot under guard supervision. It was honest work, physical but not punishing, and the guards treated them more like laborers than prisoners. On their first morning at the depot, Sergeant Brown, stocky, middle-aged, and perpetually chewing gum, greeted the group with a clipboard in hand. "All right, gentlemen," he said, "today's simple. Stack what's already cut. No escaping, no fighting, no stupidity, and we'll get along fine. Water barrel is in the shade. Bathrooms are behind the shed. If anyone gets hurt, Shout. Let's keep all fingers attached. Understood? The Germans exchanged uneasy glances. In the Wehrmacht, such instructions would have been barked, not spoken conversationally. Brown, on the other hand, seemed more concerned about safety than dominance. Carl stepped forward. Sergeant, you are not worried we will escape? Brown glanced at him, unimpressed. If you run, you'll be caught. If you're caught, you lose privileges. And if you're not caught, well, then you get to wander the American countryside with no money, no English, and a whole nation looking for you. He spat his gum into a paper wrapper and shrugged. Not exactly a winning plan. Even Otto couldn't argue with that. The work went smoothly. Brown chatted with the men, asked about their hometowns, even cracked jokes. Once he approached Carl directly while they stacked logs. You were Luftwaffe, right? Carl nodded cautiously. Pilot? Bomber crew, Carl answered. Brown let out a low whistle. Hell of a job. Glad I wasn't underneath you guys. Carl stiffened, expecting hostility, but Brown only smiled sadly. War's a damn tragedy, son. Two groups of young men trying to survive, decisions made by old ones. Come on, grab that end. The two of them lifted a heavy beam together. Carl didn't respond, but something subtle shifted inside him. The enemy wasn't taunting him. The enemy felt sorry for him. The afternoon break brought more surprises. The guards distributed apples and sandwiches, thick slices of ham between soft white bread. The POWs ate sitting on logs, staring at the food like it was contraband. Meyer shook his head. This is not how prisoners are supposed to be treated. Otto laughed, mouth full. I hope they continue treating us wrong. Carl opened his sandwich, staring at it thoughtfully. This is normal for them, he said softly. For us, but not for them. Meyer frowned. What do you mean? Carl searched for the words. In Germany, prisoners suffer to break them. Here, prisoners are fed to keep them human. The realization tasted heavier than the bread in his hand. That night, when they returned to camp, something unusual was happening in the barracks hall. A crowd gathered around the front of the room. Voices were raised, angry, strained, growing louder. Carl pushed through the men until he saw what was happening. Hauptmann Vogel stood rigid near the bulletin board, veins bulging in his neck, while two younger prisoners faced him with fists clenched. You will obey orders, Vogel roared. You will maintain discipline. One of the prisoners, a farmer from Bavaria named Andreas, spat at the officer's boots. No more, Andreas said through clenched teeth. You can't punish us for telling our families the truth. The room went still. Carl felt his heartbeat in his throat. Vogel looked like he'd been slapped. You dare! We dare, Andreas snapped. We are treated better by Americans as prisoners than we ever were by our own officers at home. Gasps rippled through the barracks. Vogel's face twisted with rage. You are a disgrace to Germany. No, Andreas said quietly, nodding toward Carl and several others. Germany is a disgrace to us, if it must lie about everything to keep us loyal. Vogel raised a hand, ready to strike, but something unexpected happened. Another prisoner, An older sergeant named Behrens stepped forward and caught Vogel's wrist. "Enough," Behrens warned. "We are not on the Eastern Front. You cannot beat men for speaking." "You would defy your superior officer?" Vogel hissed. "Here," Behrens replied. "In this place?" He released Vogel's arm. "You are not the only authority anymore." The silence was suffocating. Dozens of prisoners watched. No one moved. Carl felt the moment burn into his mind. This was more than a scuffle, more than tension. It was the first open split. The first time loyalty to the Reich had cracked, not from torture or starvation, but from decency, dignity, and truth. Vogel stepped back, breathing hard, eyes wild with disbelief. He realized in real time that his authority was slipping, not because the men hated him, but because the world inside the camp had exposed the lies he depended on. Carl looked around the barracks. Men who once clung to party lines now looked ashamed. Men who once feared disobedience now stood taller. For the first time, the question whispered inside every POW found a voice in the open. If the enemy treats us like men, and our own officers treat us like tools, who deserves our loyalty? Carl felt the weight of that truth settle heavily inside him. The war was still raging across continents, but here, in this wooden barracks under dim lantern light, the real battle had begun. Not for territory, not for victory, but for the hearts and minds of the men who no longer knew which world they wanted to return to. Winter rolled in, hard. Cold wind swept down from the plains, carrying the smell of frost and distant forests. The camp fences groaned under the weight of snow, and the barrack stoves burned from dawn until well after lights out to keep everyone warm. But the real chill didn't come from the weather. It came from the silence between the prisoners themselves. Ever since the clash with Hauptmann Vogel, the camp had split, quietly but unmistakably, into two factions. Those who clung fiercely to the Reich's ideals, and those who had begun to see the cracks running through everything they'd been taught. Carl found himself somewhere in the middle, drifting steadily, uncomfortably, toward the second group. He didn't admit it aloud, not yet, but he felt it. Every time he heard an American joke with a prisoner, every time he tasted hot coffee on a freezing morning, every time he read a newspaper filled with information the Reich would never allow, the old certainties inside him shrank a little more. One frigid morning, the camp awoke to find a new addition near the recreation yard, a wooden shack with painted words above the door. Education Center, POW classes, voluntary. Inside, American teachers, some soldiers, some civilians, had begun offering lessons. English, mathematics, carpentry, agriculture, even political science. Political science. Carl's stomach tightened when he saw the sign. "This is dangerous," Meyer muttered beside him. "This is how they brainwash men." Otto, who had become the camp's greatest enthusiast of anything remotely resembling a distraction, shook his head. Or maybe they just don't want us sitting around freezing our bones off all winter. Carl didn't volunteer for a class at first. He merely walked past, observing. But every day the classroom filled. Every day new voices spoke inside, discussing government, rights, democracy, economics, things the Reich insisted Germans had no need to understand. One evening, curiosity finally dragged Carl inside. The teacher, Mr. Harlan, was an older man with silver hair and glasses hanging from a chain. He spoke German with a heavy accent, but he spoke it gently. "Today," he said, "we talk about constitutions, why nations write them, why they matter, why laws must bind leaders as well as citizens." The room was still. This subject, back home, was forbidden except under strict ideological framing. Discussing governance outside the party's approved script was heresy. A POW raised his hand. "In Germany, the Führer decides all policy. We do not vote on laws. The state speaks for us." "Yes," Harlan said calmly. "In America, the people speak for the state." That sentence struck the room like a lightning bolt. Carl felt his throat tighten. A younger prisoner turned to him. "Is that true?" Carl swallowed. "Yes, I believe it is." Harlan continued, unaware of the storm inside the men. "Power must be limited," he said. "If not, leaders become tyrants. No matter the nation, no matter the era." A POW from Hamburg shifted uncomfortably. "If we had spoken like this at home, we'd be thrown in prison." Harlan nodded. "Which proves the point." That simple statement, so calm, so logical, felt like a quiet explosion inside the classroom. Carl left early, heart pounding. He didn't want to think, didn't want to question, didn't want to unravel the beliefs he'd carried since childhood. But the questions stayed. The next morning, he joined the lumber work detail again. Snow crunched under his boots, the air sharp as a blade. But even the cold couldn't distract him. As they worked, Sergeant Brown approached with his usual clipboard. "Hoffman, mind giving me a hand with the big logs today?" Carl nodded and followed him. They worked in silence for a while, chopping and stacking wood. Then Brown paused, leaning on his axe. "You boys been taking the classes?" he asked casually. Carl hesitated. "Some have." "You?" Carl's breath fogged in the cold air. "Just listening." Brown nodded. "Listening's good. No harm in learning how the world works." Carl frowned. Why teach these subjects to prisoners? Why educate enemy soldiers? Brown wiped his gloves. "You're not our enemy anymore. Not while you're in custody. You're men. And someday when the war's over, you'll go home. Better you know something about what peace looks like." Carl inhaled sharply, stunned. The idea that an enemy nation was preparing them, not for obedience, not for punishment, but for life after war, felt surreal. Brown continued, "I won't pretend America's perfect, but we try. And when you leave this place, we want you to have something better in your heads than what you came in with." Carl said nothing for a long time. Finally, quietly, he asked, "Why do you care?" Brown shrugged. "Because cruelty breeds enemies. Fairness can make friends." The simplicity of that answer lodged itself in Carl's chest like a burning coal. That night, back in the barracks, Vogel marched through the aisles like a specter. His face was pale, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. "Starting tomorrow," Vogel barked, "no one will attend the political classes. They are corrupting your minds." Otto raised an eyebrow. "No one? Or just the ones who disagree with you?" Vogel ignored him. He pinned a notice to the bulletin board with trembling hands. "All discussions of American government or politics are prohibited." A murmur rolled through the barracks like thunder. Carl stared at the notice. For the first time, Vogel didn't look authoritarian. He looked afraid. Not of the Americans, not of camp discipline. He was afraid of his own men, afraid of losing control, afraid of losing the narrative, afraid that once men tasted the freedom to question, they would never stop. Carl lay awake that night under the scratchy wool blanket. Outside, snow fell silently in the darkness. Inside, his thoughts drifted endlessly. The Americans had not broken him. They hadn't tried to. They had simply let him see that there were other ways to live, to think, to be. And that terrified him more than any weapon the United States possessed. By midwinter, the camp no longer felt like a battlefield of loyalties. It felt like a fault line, one that creaked and groaned under the weight of everything the prisoners had once believed. The snow continued falling in soft, heavy sheets, turning the camp into a quiet landscape of white mounds and crisp, untouched drifts. On some mornings, the only sounds were the crunch of boots and the distant hum of a generator warming the mess hall. Carl found himself spending more time outdoors, standing near the tall boundary fence. Some days he watched the American guards patrol lazily, with their rifles slung over their shoulders. Other days he simply listened. Birds, wind, the laughter of POWs who'd stopped pretending they weren't enjoying themselves. The fence didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt symbolic. Not a barrier keeping the Germans in, but a barrier keeping the war out. One afternoon, while the lumber detail rested during a break, Sergeant Brown approached Carl with something in his hand. "Got a letter for you," the sergeant said, handing him an envelope with German handwriting. "Came in last night." Carl's breath caught. Another letter. He wiped sawdust off his gloves and opened it. His mother's words spilled across the page. "My dear son, we receive your letters. I can hardly believe what you write. Good food, warmth, even games. I thought the Americans would treat you like the newspapers say. But it seems the newspapers lie more than I knew. Our town was bombed again. Many families are gone. We live in the cellar most nights. We hear rumors, terrible rumors, about what happens in the East. I do not know what to believe, but I pray you are safe. Come home when you can. Mother." Carl folded the paper slowly, his breath fogging the cold air. Brown watched him carefully. "Bad news." Carl shook his head. "Not bad. Just true." Brown nodded without asking for details. "Truth's a heavy thing," he said. "Heavier than those logs." Carl gave a hollow laugh. "Yes, much heavier." Back in camp that evening, another stir was brewing. But this time a different wind was blowing through the barracks. A large group of POWs had gathered around the center table, whispering excitedly. Carl approached cautiously, expecting another clash with Vogel. Instead, he found something astonishing. Books, newspapers, handwritten notes, pamphlets that American instructors had given them. A small circle of POWs, led by Behrens and Andreas, were discussing political ideas openly, boldly, without fear. And Vogel? He stood in the corner, arms crossed, glaring, but powerless. Behrens tapped the table. "We form a discussion group," he announced quietly. "Every evening. Anyone may join. Anyone may speak. No more secrecy." Otto grinned. "A club? What do we call it?" "Call it whatever you like," Behrens said. "But we will talk. We will learn. We will think. The Americans do not stop us. And we are soldiers of a nation that once valued ideas before the party strangled them." Meyer shook his head. "This is madness. When we return home, they will call us traitors." Behrens leaned forward. "If we return home, we will be asked what we saw here, what we learned, and some of us refuse to lie." Carl felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the enormity of the moment. This wasn't mere doubt anymore. It was organization, conscious, intentional, unafraid. Vogel finally exploded. "This is treason! You will tear down everything we stand for!" "No," Behrens replied calmly. "We will build what Germany should stand for." A stunned silence followed. Carl realized something then. The Americans hadn't converted anyone. They hadn't needed to. They had simply created an environment where truth could breathe, and truth, once released, spread like wildfire. The next morning, Carl walked with Otto to the rec yard. Snow crunched underfoot. The sky was pale blue, almost painfully bright. American soldiers shoveled paths between the barracks, laughing as they worked. Near the baseball field, Jimmy waved. "Hoffman, Weiss, we're short a few guys. Want to help pack down the field?" Otto immediately jogged over. Carl followed, slowly but willingly. They worked side by side with Americans, stomping the snow and leveling it. Jimmy tossed Carl a broom. "Clear the baseline for me?" Carl caught it easily. "Of course." "Of course," Jimmy mimicked with a grin. "Listen to you. English getting better every week." Carl didn't deny it. He glanced toward the fence, not the oppressive line of wire he remembered from his first day, but a boundary softened by snow, sunlight, and the constant presence of men who treated him as though he belonged here. For a moment Carl wondered, not with fear, but with clarity. Am I starting to feel more free inside this fence than I ever did outside it? The thought startled him so much he nearly dropped the broom. Jimmy noticed. "You all right?" Carl nodded. "Just thinking." "Dangerous habit," Jimmy joked. "Might end the war if too many people start doing it." Carl smiled, but inside, the truth stung. Because thinking, real thinking, was exactly what the Reich feared, and exactly what this camp had allowed. Standing on the snowy field with an American soldier who knew his name, Carl understood something he could never say aloud. The war inside him was shifting, not because of defeat, not because of fear, not because of coercion, but because the enemy had treated him as a man, and the Reich never had. Spring crept in softly, melting the snow into muddy trails across the camp. The trees budded with new leaves, the air warmed, and the baseball field finally lost its stubborn winter crust. Life returned to the compound, slowly, steadily, almost peacefully. But war has a way of reminding men that the world outside the wire is still burning. It began with a distant sound, barely heard from inside the barracks. A radio broadcast. The American guards always listened to the news, turning the volume low, careful not to disturb the prisoners. But on this morning, the volume crept up, not intentionally, but because the guards forgot the windows were open. Carl was sweeping the barracks floor when he froze. A calm American voice carried through the thin spring air. Fierce fighting on the Western Front continues as Allied forces push deeper into Germany. Reports confirm the fall of Cologne. Heavy bombing has struck Munich, Nuremberg, and Dresden. The broom slipped from Carl's hands. His breath hitched in his throat. Munich, his home, his mother. A wave of cold panic washed through him. Otto stopped mid-conversation. "Carl, what is it?" Carl stepped outside before he could answer. He needed to hear more. Several POWs had already gathered near the fence where the American guard sat listening to the broadcast. The MPs didn't turn the radio off, didn't move to block the sound. They simply let the news travel. Refugees moving south, railroad lines cut, fuel reserves estimated to be nearly exhausted, civilian suffering increasing. The words struck like artillery shells. One prisoner sank to his knees. Another cursed into the dirt. Meyer placed his hands on his head and whispered a prayer. Carl stared at the ground, vision blurring. Dresden. He'd walked those streets as a boy. He'd bought pastries with his mother from a bakery near the Frauenkirche. He felt something break inside him. Not a bone, not a loyalty, a denial. For months, these men had allowed themselves to pretend, if only a little, that they were living in a bubble far from destruction. A bubble where food was hot, questions were safe, and Americans smiled without hidden knives. But that bubble burst with 6 words, deep into the heart of Germany. A guard walked over, standing a cautious distance away. "You boys hear in the broadcast?" he asked softly. No one answered. The guard exhaled, as if gathering the courage to speak. "I'm sorry. War's hell. For everyone." Carl swallowed hard. "For everyone?" "My family, my city." The guard nodded, understanding the unspoken fear. "If you want," he said gently, "I'll ask the Red Cross if they can send an inquiry about your folks. They've done it for others." That small kindness cracked something open inside Carl. As the broadcast continued, faintly in the distance, Carl turned away, hands trembling. War had returned, not with gunfire, but with truth. And now the camp felt heavier, quieter. The fence felt higher. But something unexpected happened that evening. The prisoners gathered, not in anger, not in despair, but in solidarity. Andreas stood before the men in the barracks hall, holding a newspaper the Americans had passed out earlier. "This war is ending," he said, voice firm. "And when it ends, we will return to a broken home, a home we barely recognize. And we must decide what kind of men we bring back with us." Heads lifted, eyes focused. This camp has shown us things we never imagined. Fairness, respect, even the freedom to think without fear. He looked around the large room, at Karl, at Otto, at men who had once followed the Reich unquestioningly. "And now we must decide," Andreas said quietly. "Do we return as the men the party wants, or the men Germany needs?" A murmur rose, soft, uneasy, but real. Karl felt his heart pound. In the back corner, Vogel stood frozen, no longer furious, now simply lost. His authority was gone. The camp had changed too much. Even he seemed to understand that. Later that night, Karl stepped outside alone. The moon hung low over the quiet compound, casting long shadows across the dirt paths. The fence loomed tall as always, but its presence felt different now. Not a cage, but a reminder. Karl approached it slowly, placing one hand against the cold metal. He whispered into the night, "Who am I going to be when this ends?" He thought of Sergeant Brown's calm wisdom, of Jimmy's easy smile, of the hot meals and warm blankets, of the books in the education center, of the dignity offered by men he'd been taught to hate. He thought of Germany, of ruins and lies, and the weight of everything he'd seen and everything he hadn't wanted to see. And then, quietly, the answer came. He didn't want to return as a weapon, or a tool, or a voice parroting propaganda. He wanted to return as a man, a thinking man, a free man. Footsteps approached behind him. Otto's voice drifted softly. "Karl, come inside. Lights out soon." Karl turned, exhaling slowly. "Yes," he said. "I'm coming." As they walked back to the barracks together, Karl glanced once more at the fence, silver under the moonlight, humming with an unseen truth. Freedom wasn't always outside the wire, and captivity wasn't always inside it. Sometimes the real war wasn't fought with guns, but with ideas. And in that silent moment, Karl made his choice. When he returned home, he wouldn't carry the Reich back with him. He would carry the truth. The war outside still raged, but inside him, the war was over.